Yes, sir. He took down a small enameled pail and went through the low door. The boy pulled back a chair and sat. He folded the blanket roughly and laid it in the chair beside him and took up the nearest cup and sipped the coffee. It wasn't real coffee. He didn't know what it was. He looked around the room. The cats watched him. After a while, the man returned with eggs rolling around on the floor of the pail. He picked up the fry pan and held it by the handle and peered into it, as into some black looking-glass, and then set it down again and spooned grease into it from a clay jar. He watched the grease melt, and then broke the eggs into the pan and stirred them about with the same spoon. 4 eggs, he said. Yes, sir. The man turned and looked at him and then turned back to his cooking. It occurred to the boy that he hadn't been speaking to him. When the eggs were done, he took down a plate and scooped them out onto it, and placed a black and silver fork on the edge of the plate and set it on the table in front of the boy. He poured more coffee and put the pot back on the stove and sat down across the table to watch him eat. You are lost, he said. The boy paused with a forkful of the eggs and studied the question. I don't think so, he said. The last man to come here was sick. He was a sick man. When was that? The man gestured vaguely in the air with one hand. What happened to him? The boy said. He died. The boy went on eating. I ain't sick, he said. He is buried in the churchyard. The boy ate. I ain't sick, he said, and I ain't lost. He is the first to be buried there in many a year, I can tell you. How many a year? I don't know. What did he come here for? He was a miner from the mountains, a boritero. He became sick, and so he came here. But it was too late. No one could do anything for him. How many other people live here? No one. Only me. Then you was the only one that tried. Tried what? To do anything for him? Yes. The boy looked up at the man. He ate. What day is it? He said. It is Sunday. I meant, what day of the month? I don't know. Do you know what month it is? No. How do you know it's Sunday? Because it comes every 7 days. The boy ate. I am a Mormon, or I was. I was a Mormon born. He wasn't sure what a Mormon was. He looked at the room. He looked at the cats. They came here many years ago, 1896, from Utah. They came because of the statehood in Utah. I was a Mormon, then I converted to the church. Then I became, I don't know what. Then I became me. What do you do here? I'm the custodian, the caretaker. What do you take care of? The church. It's done fell down. Yes, of course. It fell down in the terremoto. Were you here then? I was not born. When was it? In 1887. The boy finished the eggs and put the fork on the plate. He looked at the man. How long have you been here? Since 6 years now. It was like this when you got here? Yes. He raised and drained his cup and set it back in the saucer. I thank you for the breakfast, he said. You are welcome. He looked like he might be getting ready to rise and leave. The man reached into his shirt pocket and took out tobacco, and a small cloth folder in which were papers cut from corn husks. One of the cats on the bunk had risen and stretched, hind leg and fore, and it leapt silently to the table and walked to the boy's plate and sniffed at it, and squatted on bowed elbows, and began delicately to pick bits of egg from the tines of the fork. The man had pinched tobacco into a paper and sat rolling it back and forth. He pushed the makings across the table toward the boy. Thanks, the boy said. I ain't never took it up. The man nodded and twisted the cigarette he'd made into the corner of his mouth and rose and went to the stove. He took a long splinter of wood from a can of them in the floor and opened the stove door and leaned and lit the splinter and with it lit the cigarette. Then he blew out the splinter and put it back in the can and shut the stove door and returned to the table with the pot and refilled the boy's cup. His own cup stood black and cold, untouched. He set the pot back on the stove and walked around the table and sat as before. The cat rose and looked at itself on the white porcelain of the plate and stepped away and sat and yawned and set about cleaning itself. "What did you come here for?" the boy said. "What did you?" "Sir? What did you come here for?" "I didn't come here. I'm just passing through." The man drew on the cigarette. "Myself also," he said. "I am the same." "You've been passing through for 6 years?" The man gestured with a small toss of one hand. "I came here as a heretic fleeing a prior life. I was running away." "You come here to hide out?" "I came because of the devastation." "Sir?" "The devastation from the terremoto." "Yes, sir." "I was seeking evidence for the hand of God in the world. I had come to believe that hand a wrathful one, and I thought that men had not inquired sufficiently into miracles of destruction, into disasters of a certain magnitude. I thought there might be evidence that had been overlooked. I thought he would not trouble himself to wipe away every handprint. My desire to know was very strong. I thought it might even amuse him to leave some clue." "What sort of clue?" "I don't know. Something unforeseen, something out of place, something untrue or out of round, a track in the dirt, a fallen bauble. Not some cause, I can tell you that. Not some cause. Causes only multiply themselves. They lead to chaos. What I wanted was to know his mind. I could not believe he would destroy his own church without reason." "You think maybe the people that lived here had done something bad?" The man smoked thoughtfully. "I thought it possible, yes. Possible. As in the cities of the plain. I thought there might be evidence of something suitably unspeakable, such that he might be goaded into raising his hand against it. Something in the rubble, in the dirt, under the vigas. Something dark. Who could say?" "What did you find?" "Nothing. A doll, a dish, a bone." He leaned and stubbed out the cigarette in a clay bowl on the table. "I am here because of a certain man. I came to retrace his steps, perhaps to see if there were not some alternate course. What was here to be found was not a thing. Things separate from their stories have no meaning. They are only shapes, of a certain size and color, a certain weight. When their meaning has become lost to us, they no longer have even a name. The story, on the other hand, can never be lost from its place in the world, for it is that place. And that is what was to be found here. The corrido, the tale. And like all corridos, it ultimately told one story only, for there is only one to tell." The cats shifted and stirred. The fire creaked in the stove. Outside in the abandoned village, the profoundest silence. "What is the story?" the boy said. "In the town of Caborca, on the Altar River, there was a man who lived there who was an old man. He was born in Caborca, and in Caborca he died. Yet he lived once in this town, in Huixiachepic. What does Caborca know of Huixiachepic? Huixiachepic of Caborca? They are different worlds, you must agree. Yet even so, there is but one world, and everything that is imaginable is necessary to it. For this world also, which seems to us a thing of stone and flower and blood, is not a thing at all, but is a tale. And all in it is a tale, and each tale the sum of all lesser tales. And yet these also are the self-same tale, and contain as well all else within them. So everything is necessary, every least thing. This is the hard lesson. Nothing can be dispensed with, nothing despised. Because the seams are hid from us, you see, the joinery, the way in which the world is made. We have no way to know what could be taken away, what omitted. We have no way to tell what might stand and what might fall. And those seams that are hid from us are, of course, in the tale itself, and the tale has no abode or places of being except in the telling only. And there it lives and makes its home, and therefore we can never be done with the telling. Of the telling there is no end, And whether in Caborca or in Huixiachipic or in whatever other place, by whatever other name, or by no name at all, I say again, all tales are one. Rightly heard, all tales are one. The boy looked into the dark disk of liquid in his cup that was not coffee. He looked at the man, and he looked at the cats. They seemed to be sleeping to a cat, and it occurred to him that the man's voice was to them no novelty, and that he must talk to himself in the absence of any God-sent ear from the outer world, or talk to the cats. "What about the man that used to live here?" he said. "Yes. This man's parents were killed by a cannon shot in the church at Caborca, where they had gone with others to defend themselves against the outlaw American invaders. Perhaps you know something of the history of this country. When the stones and rubble were cleared away, the boy lay in the arms of his dead mother. The boy's father lay nearby, and he tried to speak. They raised him up. The blood ran from his mouth. They bent to hear what he would say, but he said nothing. His chest was crushed, and he breathed blood, and he lifted one hand as if in farewell, and then he died. The boy was brought to this town. Of Caborca he remembered little. He remembered his father, certain things. He remembered his father lifting him in his arms to see puppets performing in the Alameda. Of his mother he remembered less, perhaps nothing. The particulars of his life are strange particulars. This is a story of misfortune, or so it would seem. The end is not yet told. Here he grew to manhood in this town. Here he married a wife, and all in God's good time was himself blessed with a son. In the first week of May in the year 1887, this man takes his son and sets out on a journey. He will go to Bavispe, and there leave the boy in the care of an uncle, who was also the boy's padrino. From Bavispe he will continue on to Bato Pito, where he will arrange for the sale of sugar from certain estancias to the south. In Bato Pito he will stay the night. This is a journey I have thought of many times, this journey and this man. He is youthful, perhaps not 30 years of age. He rides a mule. The boy rides in the bow of the saddle before him. It is in the springtime, and the wildflowers are blooming in the meadows along the river. He has promised to return with a gift for his young wife. He sees her standing there. She waves goodbye to him as he sets out. He has no likeness of her other than that which he carries in his heart. Think of that. Perhaps she is crying, standing there watching him out of sight, standing in the very shadow of this church that is doomed to fall. Life is a memory, then it is nothing. All law is writ in a seed. The man had arched his fingers above the table to place the scene. He passed one hand from left to right to show where things had been and how it must have been with the sun and with the rider, or with the woman where she stood, as if he'd shape out in the present air the spaces where such things had been. At Bavispe there was a fair, a traveling circus, and the man held his young son aloft under the paper lanterns as his father before him, so that the child might see. A clown, a magician, a man who held up serpents in his naked hands. The next morning he departed alone for Bato Pito as told, leaving the child behind. And there in Bavispe the child died, crushed in the terremoto. The padrino held the boy in his arms and wept. The town of Bato Pito was spared. Even today you can see the great crack in the mountain wall across the river, like an enormous laugh. And that was all the news they had of disaster in Bato Pito. Nothing else was known. Returning to Bavispe the following day, this man met a traveler afoot who told him the news. He could not believe the man's words, and he urged the mule on, and when he arrived at Bavispe all was in ruin, as the traveler had told, and death was everywhere in great abundance. He entered the town already in terror of what he should find. He heard gunshots. Dogs ran out that had been at the bodies in the rubble and scampered past him, and men with guns ran out and stood in the street, shouting. In the Alameda, the dead lay on mats of river reed, and old women dressed in black walked to and fro among the rows with green fronds to keep the flies away. The padrino came to him, and wept at the mule's stirrup, and could not speak, but only took the reins in his own hands and led him sobbing. Through the Alameda were laid dead merchants and farmers, and the wives of merchants and farmers, dead schoolgirls, lying on reeds in the Alameda of Bavispe, a dead dog in a carnival costume, a dead clown. Youngest of them all, his son, crushed and lifeless. He dismounted, and there he knelt and clasped the bloody ruin of the child to his breast. The year is 1887. What thoughts must have been his? Who cannot feel his anguish? He returns to Huitzilopochtli, bearing across the mule's haunches the corpse of the child with which God had blessed his house. Waiting for him in Huitzilopochtli is the mother of the child, and this is the gift he brings her. Such a man is like a dreamer who wakes from a dream of grief to greater sorrow yet. All that he loves has now become a torment to him. The pin has been pulled from the axis of the universe. Whatever one takes one's eye from threatens to flee away. Such a man is lost to us. He moves and speaks, but is himself less than the merest shadow among all that he beholds. There is no picture of him possible. The smallest mark upon the page exaggerates his presence. Who would seek the company of such a man? That which speaks in us one to another, and is beyond our words or beyond the lifting or the turning of a hand to say that this is the way my heart is, or this. That thing was lost in him. So. The boy watched him. His eyes were bright, and he had placed one hand palm upward on the table, as if within it lay the very thing lost. He closed his fist upon it. We lose sight of him for some years. He abandons his wife in the ruins of this town. Many friends are dead. Of his wife, nothing more is known. He is in Guatemala. He is in Trinidad. How could he return? Had he but saved some part of the burial of his life, then perhaps there would have been no need to come with flowers and grief. And yet, as it was, there was no part of him left to do so. You see? Men spared their lives in great disasters, often feel in their deliverance the workings of fate, the hand of Providence. This man saw in himself again what he'd perhaps forgot, that long ago he'd been elected out of the common lot of men. For what he was asked now to reckon with was that he'd been called forth twice out of the ashes, out of the dust and rubble. For what? You must not suppose such elections to be happy ones, for they are not. In his sparing he found himself severed from both antecedents and posterity alike. He was but some brevity of a being. His claims to the common life of men became tenuous, insubstantial. He was a trunk without root or branch. Perhaps there was yet even then a moment when he would have gone to the church to pray. But the church lay in pieces on the ground, and in the darkened chancel within him had the ground also shifted, also cracked. There also was a ruin. A waste had opened in his soul, and perhaps he saw with some new clarity how like the church he was, himself but a thing of clay. And perhaps he thought that the church would not be raised again, as to do such work requires first that God be in men's hearts, for it is there alone that it truly has its being, and there, failing, no power can build it back again. He became a heretic. So. After many a youthful wandering, this man appeared at last in the capital, and there he worked for some years. He was a bearer of messages. He carried a satchel of leather and canvas secured with a lock. He had no way to know what the messages said, nor had he any curiosity concerning them. The stone facades of the buildings among which he went on his daily rounds were pitted with the marks of old gunfire. In places above the reach of people to collect them, there yet remained smeared here and there the dark medallions of lead, which had been rounds from machine-gun emplacements in the streets. The rooms in which he stood waiting were rooms from which men in high office had been dragged to their execution. Need one say he was a man without politics? He was simply a messenger. He had no faith in the power of men to act wisely in their own behalf. It was his view, rather, that every act soon eluded the grasp of its propagator, to be swept away in a clamorous tide of unforeseen consequence. He believed that in the world was another agenda, another order, and with this power lay whatever brief he may have held. In the meantime he waited to be called to he knew not what. The man leaned back. He looked up at the boy and smiled. "Do not misunderstand me," he said. "The events of the world can have no separate life from the world. And yet the world itself can have no temporal view of things. It can have no cause to favor certain enterprises over others. The passing of armies and the passing of sands in the desert are one. There is no favoring, you see. How could there be? At whose behest?" This man did not cease to believe in God, nor did he come to have some modern view of God. There was God, and there was the world. He knew that the world would forget him, but that God could not. And yet that was the very thing he wished for. Easy to see that naught save sorrow could bring a man to such a view of things. And yet a sorrow for which there can be no help is no sorrow. It is some dark sister traveling in sorrow's clothing. Men do not turn from God so easily, you see. Not so easily. Deep in each man is the knowledge that something knows of his existence. Something knows, and cannot be fled nor hid from. To imagine otherwise is to imagine the unspeakable. It was never that this man ceased to believe in God. No. It was rather that he came to believe terrible things of him. By now he is a pensioner in Mexico. He has no friends. By day he sits in the park. The very ground under his feet is composted with the blood of the ancients. He watches passers-by. He has become convinced that those aims and purposes with which they imagine their movements to be invested are in reality but a means by which to describe them. He believes that their movements are the subject of larger movements in patterns unknown to them, and these in turn to others. He finds no comfort in these speculations, I can tell you. He sees the world slipping away. All about him an enormous emptiness without echo. It was at this time that he began to pray. From no very pure motive, perhaps. But then, what would such a motive look like? Can God be cajoled? Can he be pled with, or asked to see the reason in one's argument? Can anything from his own hand do aught to please him more than had it acted otherwise? Can he be surprised? In his heart this man had already begun to plot against God, but he did not know it yet. He would not know it until he began to dream of him. Who can dream of God? This man did. In his dreams God was much occupied. Spoken to, he did not answer. Called to, did not hear. The man could see him bent at his work, as if through a glass, seated solely in the light of his own presence, weaving the world. In his hands it flowed out of nothing, and in his hands it vanished into nothing once again, endlessly, endlessly. So, here was a God to study, a God who seemed a slave to his own self-ordinated duties, a God with a fathomless capacity to bend all to an inscrutable purpose. Not chaos itself lay outside of that matrix. And somewhere in that tapestry, that was the world in its making, and in its unmaking, was a thread that was he, and he woke weeping. On a certain day he rose and put his few possessions into an old valise he'd kept beneath his bed these years, and descended the stairwell for the last time. He carried his Bible beneath his arm, like the peregrine minister of some paltry sect. In 3 days' time he was in the town of Caborca, of sacred memory. Standing there by the river, squinting up in the sunshine, where the dome of the broken transept of the church of La Purísima Concepción de Nuestra Señora de Caborca floated in the pure desert air. So. The man shook his head slowly. He had taken up his makings from the table and begun to roll another cigarette, very thoughtfully, as if its construction were a puzzle to him. He rose and went to the stove and lit the cigarette with the same blackened splinter of wood, and inspected the fire and shut the stove door and returned to the table and sat as before. Perhaps you know the town of Caborca. The church is very beautiful. By the flooding of the river through the years, much has been destroyed. The sanctuary and 2 bell towers. The rear of the nave and most of the south transept. What remains of it stands on 3 legs, so to speak. The dome hangs in the sky like an apparition, and so it has hung for many years. Most improbably. No mason could devise such a structure. For years the people of Caborca waited for it to fall. It was like a thing unfinished in their lives. Events of doubtful outcome were made subject to its standing. It was said of certain old and venerable men that when they died, the dome would fall. And they died, and their children died, and the dome floated on in the pure air, until at last it came to bear such import in the minds of the people of that town that they scarce would speak of it at all. This was what he came to. Perhaps he did not even consider the question as to how he had been brought to this place. Yet it was the very thing he sought. Beneath that perilous roof he threw down his pallet and made his fire, and there he made ready to receive that which had eluded him, by whatever name. There in the ruins of that church, out of whose dust and rubble he had been raised up 70 years before and sent forth to live his life, such as it was, such as it had become, such as it would be. He drew slowly on the cigarette. He studied the rising smoke, as if in its slow uncoiling lay the lineaments of the history he told. Dream or memory or builded stone. He tapped the ash into the bowl. The people of the town came, and they stood about, at a certain distance. They were interested to see what God would do with such a man. Perhaps he was a crazy person, perhaps a saint. He paid them no mind. He paced and muttered into his Bible, and he thumbed the pages. Overhead in the vault were frescoes depicting the very events he pondered. On the west wall of the dome, the clay nests of golondrinas mortared up among the fading vestments of the saints. From time to time in his circling he'd pause and hold his book aloft and thump at a page with his finger and address his God at large. This is what they saw. An old hermit. A man with no history. Some said a holy man come among them, and some a lunatic, and many were scandalized who'd not heard God addressed before in such a manner, not seen God bearded in his very house. It seemed that what he wished this man was to strike some colindancia with his Maker, assess boundaries and metes, see that lines were drawn and respected. Who could think such a reckoning possible? The boundaries of the world are those of God's devising. With God there can be no reckoning. With what would one bargain? They sent for the priest. The priest came and spoke with the man. The priest outside the church, beneath the shadow of the perilous vault. The priest spoke to this misguided man of the nature of God and of the Spirit and the will and of the meaning of grace in men's lives. And the old man heard him out and nodded his head at certain salient points. And when the priest was done, this old man raised his book aloft and shouted at the priest, "You know nothing!" That is what he shouted. "You know nothing!" The people looked at the priest to see how he would respond. The priest studied the man and then went away again. The conviction with which the old man spoke had jarred his heart, and he weighed the old man's words and was troubled, because of course the old man's words were true ones. And if the old man knew that, then what else must he know? He returned the next day, and the day after. People came to attend, scholars of the town, to hear what was said on either side. The old man at his pacing under the shadow of the vault, the priest outside. The old man thumbing his book with a terrible dexterity, like a money counter. The priest countering from those high canonical principles to which he gave such latitude. Both of them heretics to the bone. He leaned forward and stubbed out the cigarette. He held up a finger, as if to countenance caution. The sun had entered the room by the south window, and certain of the cats had risen to stretch, to rearrange themselves. "With this difference," he said, "with this difference. The priest wagered nothing. He'd nothing at a hazard. He stood on no such ground as the crazed old man, under no such shadow. Rather, he chose to stand outside the critical edifice of his own church, and by this choice he sacrificed his words of their power to witness. The old man, by whatever instinct, stood on ground at once blessed and thoughtful. This was his choice, this his gesture. All agreed his testimony was a powerful one. The strength of his conviction was plain to them. In his words there was little measure and little of restraint. In his new life the libertine was out. You see, by his arrogance he had engaged the living thing. On that perilous ground he had made of himself the only witness there can ever be. And if some saw in his eyes the rapture of madness, what else would one look for in one who had enjoined the God of the universe on ground of that God's own choosing? For that is always the nature of such ground, perilous and transitory. And it is indeed so that you must make your case there or nowhere. And the priest, a man of broad principles, of liberal sentiments, even a generous man, something of a philosopher. Yet one might say that his way through the world was so broad it scarcely made a path at all. He carried within himself a great reverence for the world, this priest. He heard the voice of the deity and the murmur of the wind and the trees. Even the stones were sacred. He was a reasonable man, and he believed that there was love in his heart. There was not. Nor does God whisper through the trees. His voice is not to be mistaken. When men hear it, they fall to their knees, and their souls are riven, and they cry out to him. And there is no fear in them, but only that wildness of heart that springs from such longing. And they cry out to stay his presence, for they know at once that while godless men may live well enough in their exile, those to whom he has spoken can contemplate no life without him, but only darkness and despair. Trees and stones are no part of it. So, the priest in the very generosity of his spirit stood in mortal peril, and knew it not. He believed in a boundless God without center or circumference. By this very formlessness, he'd sought to make God manageable. This was his colindancia. In his grandness he had ceded all terrain, and in this colindancia God had no say at all. To see God everywhere is to see him nowhere. We go from day to day, one day much like the next, and then, on a certain day, all unannounced, we come upon a man, or we see this man who is perhaps already known to us, and is a man like all men, but who makes a certain gesture of himself, that is like the piling of one's goods upon an altar. And in this gesture we recognize that which is buried in our hearts, and is never truly lost to us, nor ever can be. And it is this moment, you see, this same moment. It is this which we long for, and are afraid to seek, and which alone can save us. So, the priest went away. He returned to town, the old man to his testament, to his pacing and to his argufying. He became something like a barrister. He pored over the record, not for the honor and glory of his Maker, but rather to find against him, to seek out in nice subtlety some darker nature, false favors, small deceptions, promises forsaken, or a hand too quickly raised. To make cause against him, you see. He understood what the priest could not, that what we seek is the worthy adversary. For we strike out to fall flailing through demons of wire and crape, and we long for something of substance to oppose us, something to contain us or to stay our hand. Otherwise there were no boundaries to our own being, and we too must extend our claims until we lose all definition, until we must be swallowed up at last by the very void to which we wished to stand opposed. The church at Caborca continued to stand as before. Even the priest could see that the ragged pensioner encamped in the rubble was all of parishioner it was ever like to have. He went away. He left the old man to his claim there under the shadow of that dome which some said could be seen to yaw visibly in the wind. He tried to smile at the old man's posture. What news of God that this church should stand or fall? What more than the wind's whim, whether the faltering dome should prove sanctuary or sepulchre to a deranged old anchorite? Nothing would be changed, nothing known. In the end, all would be as before. Acts have their being in the witness. Without him, who can speak of it? In the end, one could even say that the act is nothing, the witness all. It may be that the old man saw certain contradictions in his position. If men were the drones he imagined them to be, then had he not rather been appointed to take up his brief by the very being against whom it was directed? As has been the case with many a philosopher, that which at first seemed an insurmountable objection to his theories came gradually to be seen as a necessary component to them, and finally the centerpiece itself. He saw the world pass into nothing in the very multiplicity of its instancing. Only the witness stood firm, and the witness to that witness. For what is deeply true is true also in men's hearts, and it can therefore never be mistold through all and any tellings. This then was his thought. If the world was a tale, who but the witness could give it life? Where else could it have its being? This was the view of things that began to speak to him, and he began to see in God a terrible tragedy, that the existence of the deity lay imperiled for want of this simple thing, that for God there could be no witness, nothing against which he terminated, nothing by way of which his being could be announced to him, nothing to stand apart from and to say, I am this and that is other. Where that is, I am not. He could create everything save that which would say him no. Now we may speak of madness. Now it is safe to do so. Perhaps one could say that only a madman could pace and rend his clothes over the accountability of God. What then to make of this man with claim that God had preserved him not once but twice out of the ruins of the earth, solely in order to raise up a witness against himself? The fire ticked in the stove. He leaned back in his chair. He pressed the tips of his fingers together 5 to 5 and flexed his hands thoughtfully against each other, as if testing the strength of some membranous proposition. A large gray cat came up the table and stood looking at him. It had one ear missing almost entirely, and its teeth hung down outside. The man pushed back slightly from the table, and the cat stepped down into his lap and curled up and subsided and turned its head and gravely regarded the boy across the table in the manner of a consultant, a cat of counsel. The man placed one hand upon it, as if to secure it there. He looked at the boy. The task of the narrator is not an easy one, he said. He appears to be required to choose his tale from among the many that are possible. But of course that is not the case. The case is rather to make many of the one. Always the teller must be at pains to devise against his listener's claim, perhaps spoken, perhaps not, that he has heard the tale before. He sets forth the categories into which the listener will wish to fit the narrative as he hears it. But he understands that the narrative is itself, in fact, no category, but is rather the category of all categories. For there is nothing which falls outside its purview. All is telling. Do not doubt it. The priest visited the old man no more. The story stood unfinished. The old man, of course, in no wise ceased to pace and rail. He at least had no plans for forgetting the injustices of his past life, the 10,000 insults, the catalogue of woes. He had the mind of the injured party, you see. Nothing was lost to him. Of the priest, what can be said? As with all priests, his mind had become clouded by the illusion of its proximity to God. What priest will denounce his robes, even to save himself? And yet the old man was not so far from his thoughts. And one day they sent for him, and they told him that the old man had fallen ill, that he lay on his pallet and spoke to no one, not even God. The priest went to see him, and it was as they said. He stood without the transept and addressed the old man. He asked if he were indeed ill. The old man lay staring at the fading frescoes, at the coming and going of the golondrinas. He cast his eyes upon the priest, and his look was haggard and hollow, and he looked away again. The priest, seeing opportunity in the weakness of others in the normal human way, took up where he'd left off those weeks before, and began to declaim to the old man concerning the goodness of God. The old man clapped his hands to his ears, but the priest only drew nearer. At last the old man staggered up from his pallet and began to scrabble up stones from the rubble and to pelt the priest with them, and so drove him away. He returned in 3 days' time and spoke again to the old man, but the old man no longer heard him. The food, the pitcher of milk, which the people of Kaborka had become accustomed to leave for him at the edge of the shadow line, these remained untouched. God had outwitted him, of course. How could there have been another possibility? In the end, it seemed he'd turned even the old man's heretical usurpations to his own service. The sense of election, which had once sustained and tormented the pensioner these years, now stood fulfilled in a way he'd not foreseen. And before his troubled gaze stood the truth in its awful purity. He saw that he was indeed elect, and that the God of the universe was yet more terrible than men reckoned. He could not be eluded, nor yet set aside, nor circumscribed about, and it was true that he did indeed contain all else within him, even to the reasoning of the heretic, else he were no God at all. The priest was greatly moved by what he saw, and this surprised him. In the end, he even overcame his fears and ventured in beneath the dome of the ruinous church to the old man's side. Perhaps this gave the old man heart. Perhaps even at this late juncture he thought the priest might bring the structure toppling down where he himself had failed. But the dome, of course, only hung in the air, and after a while the old man began to speak. He took the priest's hand, as of the hand of a comrade, and he spoke of his life, and what it had been, and what it had become. He told the priest what he had learned. In the end, he said that no man can see his life until his life is done, and where then to make amending? It is God's grace alone that we are bound by this thread of life. He held the priest's hand in his own, and he bade the priest look at their joined hands, and he said, "See the likeness. This flesh is but a memento, yet it tells the true. Ultimately, every man's path is every other's. There are no separate journeys, for there are no separate men to make them. All men are one, and there is no other tale to tell." But the priest only took his telling for confession, and when the old man was done, he began the words of absolution. At this, the old man seized his arm midway in its crossing there in the still air by his deathbed side and stayed him with his eyes. He let go the priest's other hand and raised his own, like a man going on a journey. "Save yourself," he hissed. "Save yourself." Then he died. Outside, in the weed-grown streets, all was silence. The man passed his cupped hand over the cat's head, sleeking back its ears. The good, the damaged. The cat lay with its forepaws curled against its chest, its eyes half closed. "This is my warrior cat," the man said. "Pero es el más dulce de todo, y el más simpático." He looked up. He smiled. "The storyteller's task is not so simple. You will have guessed by now, of course, who was the priest. Or perhaps not so much priest as advocate of priestly things, priestly views. This priest for a while yet would strive to cling to his calling, but in the end he was no longer able to bear the look in the eyes of those who came to him for counsel. What counsel had he to give, this man of words? He had no answers to the questions the old messenger had brought from the capital. The more he considered them, the more knotted they became. The more he attempted even to formulate them, the more they eluded his every representation. And finally he came to see that they were not the old pensioner's queries at all, but his own. The old man was buried in the churchyard at Kaborka among those of his own blood. Such was the working out of God's arrangement with this man. Such was his colondancia, and such perhaps is every man's. At his dying he had told the priest that he had been wrong in his every reckoning of God, and yet had come at last to an understanding of him anyway. He saw that his demands upon God resided intact and unspoken also in even the simplest heart. His contention, his argument, They had their being in the humblest history. For the path of the world also is one and not many. And there is no alter course in any least part of it, for that course is fixed by God, and contains all consequence in the way of its going. And outside of that going, there is neither path, nor consequence, nor anything at all. There never was. In the end, what the priest came to believe was that the truth may often be carried about by those who themselves remain all unaware of it. They bear that which has weight and substance, and yet for them has no name whereby it may be evoked or called forth. They go about ignorant of the true nature of their condition. Such are the wiles of truth, and such its stratagems. Then one day, on that casual gesture, that subtle movement of divestiture, they wreak all unknown upon some ancillary soul a havoc such as that soul is forever changed, forever wrenched about in the road it was intended upon, and set instead upon a road heretofore unknown to it. This new man will hardly know the hour of his turning nor the source of it. He will himself have done nothing that such a great good befall him. Yet he will have the very thing, you see, unsought for and undeserved. He will have in his possession that elusive freedom which men seek with such unending desperation. What the priest saw at last was that the lesson of a life can never be its own. Only the witness has power to take its measure. It is lived for the other only. The priest therefore saw what the anchorite could not, that God needs no witness, neither to himself nor against. The truth is rather that if there were no God, then there could be no witness, for there could be no identity to the world, but only each man's opinion of it. The priest saw that there is no man who is elect, because there is no man who is not. To God every man is a heretic. The heretic's first act is to name his brother, so that he may step free of him. Every word we speak is a vanity. Every breath taken that does not bless is an affront. Bear closely with me now. There is another who will hear what you never spoke. Stones themselves are made of air. What they have power to crush never lived. In the end, we shall all of us be only what we have made of God. For nothing is real, save His grace. When he had mounted up, the man stood at his stirrup and squinted up at him in the mid-morning sun.